the most important election in the history of our country.
This election is the most important in the modern history of this country.
The election in 2020, without hyperbole, is going to be the most important election this country has undergone in over 100 years. Not a joke.
This November's elections are more important than any I can remember in my lifetime, and that includes when I was on the ballot.
There are just 8 days left in what is the most important election of our lifetimes.
This will be maybe the most important election that our country's ever had.
There's never been a more important tomorrow in modern electoral history in the United States than tomorrow. And that's not hyperbole.
We know what is on the line and what is the truly most important election of our lifetime. Has anybody ever said that to you before?
This election is the most important election in our lifetimes.
All right.
No matter what generation you come from.
I truly believe this is the most important election of our lifetimes.
This is, I think, going to be the most important election that we've ever had.
Really one of the most important elections in American history.
In every campaign, they tell you the same thing. This is the most important election in a generation, the most important election in our lifetime. This one truly is.
2008 is the most important election in our lifetime.
This is certainly the most important election in my lifetime.
This is the most important election you've ever voted in your entire life.
My fellow Americans, this is the most important election of our lifetime.
All these choices make this one of the most important elections in our history.
The election of 2004 is one of the most important, not just in our lives, but in our history.
In 2000, as we go into what I think is the most important election we've had in a generation.
In what will be, I am convinced, one of the most important elections we're likely to see for the next 50 years.
It's the most important election of my lifetime.
I think one thing you and I agree on is the last election was perhaps as insignificant and uninteresting as any presidential election in our lifetimes.
Yes.
1996.
End on George Will there, agreeing that 1996 was the least important election of his lifetime. Welcome, everybody. We're back with another episode of Wigs for Wigs. And today we are talking about the most important elections in American history and some general electoral history from the United States. So stick around. We will be right back to discuss election history on Wigs for Wigs. Welcome back, everybody. It's your host, Joe Cook. I'm joined once again by Bill Venezia here, coming to you from Jersey City. And today we're getting back into the world of politics and history, and we're going to be talking about some of the most important elections in American history, and maybe some of the least important elections in American history. It's election time. We are, what are we? Couple weeks out of 2 weeks? 2 weeks away from the midterm elections here in 2022. And as always, we've been hearing a lot of hyperbole on the television sets. If you turn into anything, watching the ads, saying how this is the most important election of our lifetimes, the 2022 midterm elections. And we hear that every election cycle. It doesn't matter what election we're talking about, what office it is, what year it is. We hear that again and again. Bill, you've heard that a lot more than me, I'm sure, just by...
Which means I'm much older.
Yeah. But we've heard it, every election we hear this, even at the local level you hear this. It's the most important election you're going to vote in. So today we're going to tackle some of these elections in history and just some general electoral history from the United States and try to break down what makes an election important, how do we define the importance of an election, and what are ones that stick out in memory for us from American history. So, Bill, I'm going to let you lead us off. I know you've been doing some research. We just picked this topic this morning. Again, listeners, you know that we tend to just kind of pick a topic and we come at you with our thoughts. So we've had a few hours here for prep, although I've been teaching all day. But, Bill, why don't you kick us off with any initial thoughts you have on important elections in American history?
Well, I think you prefaced it by saying
that this isn't the most important election in American history. That's number one. But if you look at elections or midterm elections from 34 to 218, the president's party has averaged a loss of 28 seats in the House and 4 Senate seats since that time. And there's only been 3 elections where the incumbent president's party actually had a plus gain, in 2 of them in both the House and the Senate, once in just the House. So that
Which elections were those?
1934 with FDR.
Okay, so that's FDR. That makes
somewhat
some sense.
understandable.
Bit of a sweep there.
1998 with Clinton, he picked up 5
Right.
House seats, and it was
Did they gain in the Senate also?
No,
the
they
Democrats?
didn't.
No,
He
I didn't
was
think so.
even. And George W. Bush,
Right.
in
Yes,
2002,
2002, yes.
8 in the House, 2 in the Senate.
And again, that's coming after 9/11. There was a bit of a wave towards the Republicans, so that makes some sense also.
Yeah, it certainly does, and the same goes for FDR, obviously.
Yeah, maybe the outlier is Clinton, but also the math just kind of makes sense there because there had been such a wave towards the Republicans with the 94 Republican Revolution with Newt Gingrich that there were a lot of seats that kind of naturally had to eventually swing back towards the Democrats.
The one thing that is very interesting is that the midterm election results are no indicator of what the presidential election is going to turn out.
Democrats will be happy to hear that right now because
there's only been a couple of times when basically the opposite party won, and that one of them comes to mind, Jimmy Carter, number one, and also LBJ. Well, JFK was basically suffered a mild loss in the 62 midterms. Wasn't around for the 64 election, but LBJ cruised in that time frame for a number of reasons.
So Democrats should be happy to hear that here in 2022 because the expectation is that the Republicans will probably take control of the House of Representatives.
Yeah, and
it'll be close probably. I don't think they're going to get a huge margin, but they're probably going to have a 5 to 10 seat majority.
I think that's probably true. I know the numbers that I looked at from the American Presidency Project indicate, well, they made a prediction. They said there'll be a 29-seat loss in the House for Dems and a 3-seat loss in the Senate. That was their prediction. I don't know.
I don't know if that
when
Senate one is going to put.
That I don't know with basically when their
that would basically require Herschel Walker, Mehmet Oz, and whoever's out in Nevada.
JD Vance or Mastro. Well, it'll come down to long after the votes, the walk-in votes are counted. This is going to come down to basically the mail-in ballots. So I'm sure by that time the Republicans will be declaring victory. But it should be interesting to see.
So midterm elections in general, historically, probably not terribly important. It can, give a boost or a little bit of a setback to a president's agenda in the middle of their term. But generally, they don't have that much of an impact. The president has already had 2 years in office by that point. They've had their honeymoon period where most presidents get most of their stuff done anyway in those first few months of their presidency. So I'm not sure how much a midterm really has impacted presidents historically.
I think it has, and I think it comes down, the most mitigating factor of a midterm election is how the economy is feeling.
Generally speaking, that's true of all elections, I think, in American history. It's the economy stupid.
I think that, but there is...
Most people, in the end, vote their pocketbooks. That's simply the reality.
It's an interesting little factoid by the same organization, the American Presidency. And they say that the second highest midterm, factor is not so much inflation, but jobs.
Yeah.
And jobs are actually up the last 2 years by 4%, job creation.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of reasons for that because there's been a lot of money thrown at it.
We also had such drastic job loss during the COVID pandemic that, again, things are going to bounce back. I mean,
absolutely.
There's a certain bounce back built into the system, elasticity.
And the question is too, how much
Does Joe Biden get credit for that?
I don't. Well, I don't.
Or do the Democrats? I shouldn't say
don't
Joe
think
Biden.
the Democrats have done a good enough job of basically talking about what they have. When you consider,
I think that's probably true.
they haven't basically been blowing their horn with regard to what legislation they've passed.
No, I think the Democrats actually this election have put all their eggs into the abortion basket.
Absolutely.
And I'm not sure really that's a winning strategy.
No, it basically it came too early in terms of the Dobbs decision. I think that they rode that wave during the summer, and actually, it kind of exhausted it, and you just can't be a one-trick pony.
Yeah. So the Democrats, we'll see how these midterms turn out in 2 weeks. I think probably what the outcome's going to be is the Democrats will probably hold on to 50-50 in the Senate. I think that's the way it's looking. Maybe 51-49. They might even gain a seat. But I think the Republicans are going to wind up with a small edge in the House of Representatives.
Oh, I think so.
Another poll I saw recently, and then I want to throw us to a break and pull in our other guest here. But another poll I saw recently talking about the midterms coming up is that 71% of Americans in a recent poll said that democracy is in danger around the world, including here in the United States, and yet only 7% said that was a major issue that they were considering and who they were going to vote for in November. So I don't know how you could have that be a major issue you see around the world, that democracy is in danger, and yet that's not front and center on your mind as you're casting a vote.
I think...
Well, I'm going to talk about Lincoln in our second segment, and I'll pull more into that. But
I kind of think that that's going to play out over the next 2 years, and that has to do with all the litigation or potential litigation that's going on surrounding the titular head of the Republican Party, Donald Trump. And I think.
So what's your prediction for the midterms, Bill?
My prediction is that I could conceivably see. Well, I definitely think that the Democrats will lose the House. I think it's a toss-up whether it's 50-50 in the Senate. I
can see either side having 50-50.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how those races we alluded to before in Nevada and Pennsylvania.
And Georgia.
And Wisconsin.
Herschel Walker.
In Georgia. Oh, God protect us from Herschel Walker.
Okay, we're going to take a quick little break here, and we'll come back, and we're going to dive into some more history to talk about historical elections that have had a major impact on American history. And we'll be right back here on Wigs for Wigs. Okay, we are back here on Wigs for Wigs, and we're actually welcoming in a second guest, my fellow history teacher, Frank McGady, who you might remember from season 1. We discussed military leaders from history. So this is our first ever three-way conversation on Wigs for Wigs, where we're going to dive into some elections from history that have been really important in the story of America and how our country has developed throughout time. So what's the election? I'll go to you first, Frank. What's the election, if I asked you, what's one election in history that really stands out as the country is really at a turning point and depends on what the outcome of the election is?
All right, I'll go with an older one that kind of really changed the history of America and even till today. And I will say the election of, let me get this one right, I think it's 18... It was Rutherford B. Hayes. Was that
1876?
76, yeah.
Hayes-Tilden, 1876.
The Republican Party, in their desire to keep the White House, which they had had since Lincoln was elected in 1860, basically gave up on Reconstruction and blacks in the South, and basically just allowed them to be taken and run by the racist governments in the South just so they could hold on to the White House. And basically that changed our history in the fact that racism and segregation was allowed to exist in the South up until the 1960s. So I would say
most people don't realize that segregation did not immediately follow the end of slavery. It wasn't like slavery ended and then segregation was put into effect. During Reconstruction, especially the short period of radical Reconstruction, 1867 to 1870 roughly, there was a real concerted effort to create an equal society in the South, a biracial democracy for the first time anywhere. Nowhere else in the world had that as an experiment at the time. And yet, the Republican Party starts to change its priorities as years go by, an economic crisis hits, and that really starts to drain the momentum from fighting for civil rights and all. And then, like you said, this election of 1876, it's a disputed election. There's uncertainty about who won 5 states.
Florida being one, as always.
Florida being one. And what happened essentially was they put together a commission to investigate this, and they decided exactly what Frank was saying, which is they made a deal, essentially.
Yeah.
The Republicans will hold on to the White House, but in return, they will pull the federal troops out of the South. Everybody knowing that that means that the old Southern Democrats will take back control of the Southern state governments,
basically the
and
Confederates.
abandon the freedmen, the former
Right.
slaves.
It would have been interesting if you put the bullet back in the Derringer, because you needed a transformational figure like Lincoln to basically oversee the Reconstruction, which would have been an interesting. It would have been interesting to see how history would have been rewritten had he not been assassinated.
Yeah, sometimes America has a tendency to elect the right person at the right time. Sometimes we don't get that leader that we need at
Look
the
what
right
we
time.
got subsequently because of that bullet. You know.
Yes.
So I'll stick with Lincoln just momentarily, and then I'll turn to you, Bill. But Lincoln's re-election is my choice for the most important election in American history. Not his initial election. I think even more important is his re-election in 1864, in the midst of Civil War, holding a re-election, an election campaign for the president, and things were not going well in the summer of 1864. How are things going for the Union
Very
during
poorly.
the Overland campaign?
Yeah, poorly. The Cold Harbor, it was terrible.
Yeah, death toll is piling up. People forget that more American soldiers, especially Union soldiers, died after the Battle of Gettysburg and the capture of Vicksburg, which are usually considered the turning points of the Civil War, than before those turning points. So this is an extremely bloody period. You can imagine what the families around the country are feeling as more and more men are dying down in the South trying to end this Civil War. And Lincoln was certain he was going to lose.
Yes.
As
yes,
the
he was.
summer of 1864 came around, he is sure he's going to lose. Everything is darkness and doubt and discouragement, Lincoln's secretary John Nicolay wrote in August of 1864. This is just a couple months before the election. Lincoln writes on August 23rd, 1864. Again, just a couple months before the election. This is a famous what's called the Blind Memorandum. He said, "This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his own election on such grounds that he cannot possibly save it afterwards." Signed A. Lincoln. And then he made his entire cabinet sign on to that piece of paper, saying we're going to do everything we can to win this election, to win this war between the time we lose the election and when the new president, George McClellan, comes into office.
His nemesis, isn't that amazing?
Oh my God, yes, I know.
I mean, politics does make strange.
Yeah, I love it.
matchups.
We're here in New Jersey. You go down to the state capitol. Anybody been to the state capitol building?
Yes.
Trenton?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
So you walk into the state capitol building. There's 2 statues when you first enter the state capitol building here in New Jersey on opposite sides of the hallway. One of them is Abraham Lincoln. Do we know who the other one is?
McClellan?
It's George McClellan. Those are the 2 people enshrined in statuary
Of course,
at
he's
the
not,
entrance.
and he's not far away in the cemetery where he has the biggest, by far, biggest monument in the cemetery.
You know,
That's true, yeah.
I think another pivotal election in American history was the election in 1940, between Roosevelt and I can't remember the gentleman, the Kansas.
1940 would have been Alf Landon.
Alf Landon,
Alf
yeah.
Landon. You had a turning
Wendell Willkie
point
was
here
44.
because the Windsor War
No, Thomas Dewey was 44.
was
Well,
blown.
when was- wait a minute.
Yeah, Dewey was 44.
Wilkie was 36.
Yeah, Wilkie was.
Or maybe
No, Wilkie was 40.
Wilkie was 40.
Alf
Alf
Landon
Landon
was
was
36.
36.
Yeah.
Yes.
But you had the Windsor War blowing, number one. You had a big isolation movement in the United
America
States.
First movement.
You had the America First movement.
Which my
You
grandmother
also
and
had the
grandfather were
German
part of.
American boom. You had the Ku Klux Klan running rampant. You have a lot of the conditions that that are going to exist in 2024 in
And
terms.
you just have people who are not happy that Roosevelt is seeking a third term,
Yes.
which had never happened before.
Yep. But the fact of the matter is, I think I guess you trust the will of the American people as much as you can, because I think that election could have tilted us towards fascism. And I think that we see the same forces at play here in 2024. You're coming off a 1938 loss of midterms for FDR, yet he was able to win that election. People trusted him, and you know what? They trusted him because he was a good communicator, and as opposed to what was going on now. I mean,
Smallest margin of all of his elections. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes, it
But-
was, yes.
But he does win.
Yes, but I think a pivotal one. And it's not that we've jousted with fascism in United States history before, but I think that one definitely is reminiscent of what the portent of things to come.
And FDR had a break in the fact that, unlike Lincoln, he was on the verge of losing when he ran for re-election in '44. We had just captured Paris, and we were pushing in the Pacific. So we were winning on all fronts, and it was pretty apparent that we were going to win the war. So when he ran in 1944 for his fourth re-election, he didn't have that. It was pretty much a done deal that he was going to win.
Let's come back to Lincoln, because tying into what you just said, Frank, Lincoln, again, was sure he was going to lose just a couple months before the election. There were Republicans urging him not to run again. Radical Republicans wanted to nominate John C. Fremont. There's all sorts of machinations going on in the Republican Party. Henry Raymond, who is the head of the Republican Party, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, was urging Lincoln to maybe not run again or back off on the Emancipation Proclamation, cancel it, so that people would, vote for him again. And he refuses all of those overtures, including the ones to back off on emancipation. He basically says, I'm going to go down with what I believe in, if that's what it means. But it's when we finally start seeing Union military victories right before.
Atlanta.
Yes, General Sherman captures Atlanta in early September, which,
That
by the
was
way,
the big one.
That's when voting started back then. Different states had different dates when they did their voting in the 1860s.
I didn't know that.
So people are voting in early September. So Sherman captures Atlanta right in time. He captures Atlanta. General Sheridan captures the Shenandoah Valley. And Admiral Farragut captures Mobile Bay, all in a short span of time. And that basically guarantees that Lincoln will win his re-election. Yeah. But up until then, it looked like a sure thing. He was going to lose to George McClellan. And George McClellan was promising he was going to end the Civil War on the basis of either giving the South their independence or, more likely, bringing the South back in, but with constitutional protections for slavery.
Interesting, too, that because it was a different time, there was a different ethos in terms of character. Lincoln's band of rivals who comprised his cabinet all stood firm with him.
Except for Sam and Chase, who bolted. But Lincoln took care of him by making him the Chief Justice that year, in the election year.
But the rest of them, who were his
Seward,
rivals,
who had always been his harshest critic, wound up being his closest advisor,
supporter,
his biggest friend.
And even what's his name? The Secretary of War was
Stanton.
Stan was very critical of him,
him early on,
and then he became a big supporter. Lincoln was so. I tell you, Lincoln is just so amazing because he was so underrated by people because he didn't have a proper education. He was kind of told these jokes. He looked tall, lanky, and people just took him for, how good could he be? And he was so smart, and he was so on top of things. And, that's why to me, I always say the greatest president, I know we're going to talk about this another time, but he is still my favorite as greatest president.
You're not going to get an argument from Mr. Gettysburg.
No, but I just think Lincoln.
No one faced what he faced.
Right. And had to deal with.
Donald Trump was the most persecuted and hated president in American history. He told us all the time.
Well, he never saw. He must have been sleeping.
Unlike Donald Trump, Lincoln didn't have a persecution
complex. Well, he learned
complex.
that the same day he learned that George Washington's army captured the airports in the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, that's true. I remember that. But yeah, Lincoln just, he doesn't get the credit. He gets a lot of credit, but he needs more. I mean, it's just amazing. He
Just
doesn't.
think about holding an election in the middle of a civil war.
And he did what McClellan thought was the stupidest thing in the world. So, oh God, he just gave him the election. He's going to allow all the soldiers to vote, and then they overwhelmingly vote for Lincoln.
Yeah, the soldiers who
Loved
go back
McClellan.
a year or
They
two,
loved McClellan.
loved McClellan.
But
You
they
go
vote-
back to the
You know why they
Gettysburg
loved
campaign.
him? Because he didn't fight.
Right. Well,
They weren't in any danger when McClellan was in command.
Oh.
But if you went back to the Gettysburg campaign, I mean, I'm going into the weeds of the Civil War here because, if you know me at all, you know why. But when Joe Hooker was fired as the Union commander just on the verge of the Battle of Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln received a letter from the governor of New Jersey at the time demanding that George McClellan be put back in command of the Union Army, or else he was going to hold off on recruiting in New Jersey. Now, I mean, obviously he backed down on that threat, but that's the sway that McClellan seemed to have on people, and including on the soldiers who did like him. I mean, part of that is that he might not have put them in all that much danger, but if that's a really pivotal election, 1864, this country goes in drastically different directions if Abraham Lincoln is reelected or if George McClellan is elected. But Lincoln had faith in the American people in having an election. He thought that was critical. This was the only major democracy in the world at the time. And as Lincoln said in 1862, we were going to either nobly save or mainly lose the last best hope of earth, which he saw America as, or government of the people, by the people, for the people, as he said at Gettysburg, which would not perish from the earth. And we saw that play out in 1864, and the people rose to the occasion and re-elected Abraham Lincoln, despite the drastic death toll of the Civil War.
And one of the things I thought was very telling was after John Wilkes Booth killed Lincoln, Booth was shocked by this, that he thought he was going to be received as a hero, and he wasn't.
No.
Many people in the South saw this as a calamity for the South because they saw Lincoln as their best hope of having a softer, easier
They had
peace.
read his second inaugural address,
Right.
with malice toward none, with charity
for all, and I think that
the alternative to him is the radicals, Thaddeus Stevens, talking
Right.
about taking everything
and
from
hanging
South,
all the slave owners.
hanging everybody.
Yeah, it's
Which maybe we would have been better off if that happened. But
but it's amazing. Even the Southerners saw how good Lincoln
sorry to my
was.
Southern listeners. I know a lot of you out there, as my former students, especially.
I think that's
from
a
the South. but-
That's a story. That's a podcast for another day.
Yeah.
And what if I saw Jeff Greenberg interviewing one of those presidential candidates in the preface to this podcast, and he wrote a book about 10 things that if they didn't happen, he hypothesized what would happen. So it was like a what if story. But I do think it would be interesting to delve into
what ifs are great.
What
because
if
you can go anywhere with
what
them.
if Booth, what if Booth missed?
I love speculative history because you can go
What-
anywhere with it. Harry Turtledove's books about what if the Confederates had automatic weapons?
Yeah.
AK-47s.
What if Dewey actually won in '48? Or what if JFK wasn't?
Here's an interesting one. The one I always thought would be interesting. What would have happened had Theodore Roosevelt won election in 1908?
1908 or 1912?
No, I'm sorry, 1912. I'm sorry. Yeah, he
1912.
Ran as the Bull Moose.
He won in 4.
Yeah.
He
chose not to run in 08.
And 1912, the Bull Moose thing.
And
What if he
like,
had won? Would we
like
have gone
Truman, he could have.
What if TR had won?
Yeah,
if TR
Truman.
won?
Yeah, I know that. He could have won. He could have run again.
What if Grant had run for a
In
third term like he
2008?
thought about doing in 1876 instead of Rutherford B. Hayes being the Republican? What if it's Grant?
Grant
Well-
is another person who doesn't get the credit. He's now finally getting militarily. He's getting a lot more credit.
You know why? The scandals. The
Yes, but he had
scandals
nothing. I know, but a lot.
sullied him, and it's sad because I think
He did a lot.
Grant
He
was
wasn't directly involved in
No, he
scandals.
wasn't.
And he did a lot of positive
His problem
things.
was that he just wouldn't get rid of people
Yeah.
if he was
Right.
personally friends with them.
Yeah, but he did a lot of
courageous
positive
man,
things
especially
himself.
at the end of his life. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I mean,
But he went after the Klan in the South.
Yeah.
Basically destroyed them.
Destroyed the Klan. There was
But,
no
you know,
Klan
as-
between 1872
right.
and 1916.
But as like a wounded cockroach, they managed to come back out during the World
Yeah.
War I and reemerge. But
it's a good analogy.
I always tell that to my class. I said they're like a cockroach. The thing you think you just stepped on and killed it, and then you see it later on crawling out. Yeah, that was a Klan.
That was the Klan. That's Yeah,
you know,
that's the plan
but
of American history.
But it'd be interesting had, you know, Grant. I always rank Grant higher. I know the scandals hurt him, but it wasn't like Harding who had the scandals and did nothing. Grant did a lot.
Yeah.
You know,
I
he
agree.
tried to bring about civil rights in the South, which was very difficult at the time when you had the Southerners just were, you know, just we're not going to do it. But it would have been interesting if Grant, if he had won a third term.
Okay, so do we have any others? So we have Lincoln's reelection was my nominee. The election of the reelection of Franklin Roosevelt in 1940.
Hayes and Tilden.
Hayes and Tilden in 1876 with Reconstruction on the line. Are there any others that really American history hinges on the outcome of the election?
Well,
since you see the two of them, it's the election of all-time great presidents.
Yeah.
The other one is not Rutherford B. Hayes, but. Are there
Some of
any
the
other
elections that you see, like 1932, you know where it's going to go.
68 was an
Yes,
interesting
well, 68
election.
was, yeah.
Because
let's talk a little bit about 68.
Yeah, that's a good
68,
one.
I mean, that's when, first of all, it came to fruition that the South had forsaken the Democratic Party, mostly because of the civil rights legislation that was passed by Johnson, who knew that would have been the case.
Johnson said after he signed the Civil Rights Act,
Here
it is, we've lost the South for a generation.
And
he's wrong, 'cause it's been more than a generation.
You know, and Nixon's Southern strategy, sadly, because the end of that election cycle.
Yeah, that last hurrah of the old South.
Humphrey was making gains, because.
Well, there's another what if. I mean, what if Bobby had not been assassinated?
Bobby, what
if it was Bobby and not Hubert Humphrey?
Then we truly would not have Nixon to kick around anymore. No. No,
he was solid liberal, but
he was proud as punch to be there. But
I think
Bobby Kennedy would have won in a walk.
Yeah,
and then the Kennedy legacy would have been like royalty again.
And then think about American history going forward from there. If there's no President Nixon,
There's no Watergate.
If there's no Watergate, how do we look at every politician since? Because I think there's been such a suspicion of all politicians.
We would have had Reagan in
since
76. We would have had Reagan in 76 because I had a feeling we would have had 2 terms of Bobby, who would have worn his welcome out by that time, and the swing back to the right would have happened, and we would have not had a placeholder like Gerald Ford.
It would have been interesting if Reagan had won in 76.
So,
how would he have dealt with all the oil embargoes, and would he have taken the Shah into America, causing them to riot and take over the embassy?
Yeah.
How would he? I mean, in all fairness, Carter always gets a bum rap as being a terrible president, but he faced unbelievable stuff that Reagan did not face. When Reagan came into office, things were getting better.
Carter was also uniquely ill-equipped.
Yes, he was. He didn't know how to work with Congress. He was very.
He had a Democratic Congress, and he couldn't work.
He couldn't work with them.
He didn't trust anybody.
But also, he was also sabotaged a lot by Ted Kennedy, who wanted to run in 1980.
And actually, that was the first time I saw the pugnacious side to Jimmy Carter, because he when he was apprised of Teddy jumping into the race, he said, "I'll kick his ass," which you never expected out of that.
Right.
Out of that Southern Baptist, a better man than president.
Really, since
absolutely. Well, just like George Bush,
just like Herbert Hoover.
Yes, Herbert Hoover and George W. Bush, a better man than they were president.
I agree. That's
both. Yeah, both Bushes, really.
Yes, both Bushes.
Bush had to redeem himself late for me.
Yes.
So, because after that, we kind of got a period where both parties more or less went to the center a little bit. The Democrats very consciously with the New Democrat strategy.
Right.
Where you look at like a Bill Clinton against Bob Dole, which is the one that we heard George Will say least important election in American history in our little preface audio. There's a few elections there where there doesn't seem to be a drastic difference between, what difference does it make who wins? Bill Clinton or Bob Dole. Even George W. Bush or Al Gore, they were both.
Gerald Ford or Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
Really, Ford.
I mean, we've had other elections in our history like that, but are there any others that really stand out as ones that it makes a major difference who won in our eyes, looking back?
Maybe
very early ones?
What about Andrew Jackson with regard to his
Andrew
second
Jackson
run?
instead of John Quincy Adams?
Yeah.
Oh, that.
How about that in terms
That
of...
would have. I think you could have avoided even the Civil War with that if John Quincy Adams had won a second term. If he had the support in Congress, if they could have put Henry Clay's American plan into action, the South would have become more industrialized, less dependent on cotton and slavery, and slavery might have just died a natural death, possibly.
So the bottom line is here on Whigs for Whigs, that the Whigs had just had power.
Yeah. Let's give those
been
Whigs.
better. I actually have a bumper sticker that says, "Don't blame me, I voted for Henry Clay."
Henry, I was in his house, Henry Clay. I was in his house. He wasn't home, but I was in his house. I did visit him later on in his little tomb. But yeah, Henry, it would have been interesting had.
Well, he's the one who at least allegedly said, "I would rather be right than be president."
But
and he had
unfortunately,
to have been just as right as Franklin Pierce is.
and Henry Clay, unfortunately, was a victim of the 3/5 compromise.
Yeah.
Because had the 3/5 compromise never existed, Henry Clay would have been the third candidate instead of Andrew Jackson. Because these southern states had more electoral votes than they deserved to have, especially like South
all the
Carolina.
southern states had
Well, they had
more
more,
electoral votes than
but
they
South
deserved to
Carolina
have.
had like almost twice as
Yeah.
many.
You would have increased the body count for duels, though, had he.
Yes, yeah.
Does the election of Andrew Jackson replacing John Quincy Adams
He might
also
have
mark
shot
a
John
little
Quincy
bit
Adams
of the beginning of the anti-intellectual streak that we see right down to today?
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah.
You
I
think about
it does.
those two men?
And I also think John Quincy Adams was sometimes paralyzed by his own capacity
Yeah.
to be
I
an
think so, too.
intellectual.
Yeah.
You know.
But think about today, where ignorance seems to almost be celebrated in certain elements of our society.
Yeah, we know that.
Yes.
We're electing Marjorie Taylor Greens to Congress. People who say fires are caused by Jewish space lasers.
Or
You can't make it up.
or what's his in Georgia, who says that our
Herschel
air.
Walker.
Yeah, Herschel Walker said the air is good here, but when it goes to China, it becomes polluted and comes back here again.
So, bottom line,
But people will vote for him. People will
bottom
vote for
line,
him.
how important is this election in 2 weeks in the grand scheme of American history?
I think it is important because I think what'll happen is that we'll get just more gridlock. Nothing will get done. The only thing I could see, nothing will get done. There'll be political skirmishes and investigations that will run rampant for 2 years, and then we'll basically get to vote for president, which will, I think 224 is a pivotal election.
Yes.
Is it as pivotal if Donald Trump runs for re-election and if Donald Trump doesn't run for election?
I think it's more pivotal if he runs.
I think it's pivotal that he runs and is rebuked. I used to say this about Nixon. I want to make sure that there's a stake in the man's heart so he stays dead. So I think in
You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore.
would that have been true? If in fact, the American people have their vote, I do not believe he would be. I think they would provide the proverbial stake in the
to be
heart
honest,
to his political career.
I understand and I agree with you. It would be really great to have him rebuked, but I just feel that things could happen, that it may not happen, that I just worry. And I think if he doesn't get the nomination, I think that would be the better thing. Just not being nominated. I think that's a big enough rebuke if the Republicans don't pick him.
It would be interesting to see if our two senior citizens warrant the choice of their party.
Can we get a nominee who's not?
I always say in my class,
octogenarian?
yeah, can we get somebody under 70?
Okay, so Frank, any last thoughts here on election history in America or the prospects of future elections here in America? Just anything, any last thoughts you have?
One of the problems I have, and I will always have this, and this is my biggest argument, is that we need to fix the electoral college system if we're going to have fair elections. I'm not saying get rid of it, but make it fairer. Maybe take away the 2 votes every state gets for their senator and base it
It is
primarily.
peculiar that just in the last handful of elections, we've had multiple ones. where the popular vote winner
Yeah.
lost the election.
Yeah, and
that happened very rarely through U.S. history, but we've had it a
and
few
even
times
when it did happen,
recently.
sometimes there was like special circumstances
Yeah.
for it. But I just, until we base it purely on population, we're going to get these skewed results where smaller states will collectively could dominate larger population states. You know, I mean, the fact that Wyoming has 3 electoral votes and has only around 500,000 people, and California has...
Right, an elector
you know,
for Wyoming represents a lot more people than an elector for, say, California.
Right, and the difference is
Or a lot
pretty
fewer
substantial.
people, I mean, a
Yeah,
lot fewer
but
people.
it is substantial, so...
Yeah.
But I don't see that ever being fixed, because the Republican Party benefits from that, and they would you didn't need an overwhelming majority to change it. And
Well, it
you
really
don't
goes
see
back to when they fixed the size of Congress at 435 representatives instead of continuing to grow it.
Right, which is understandable since, you know...
Yeah, I mean, we
it's-
can't have thousands of people in Congress, but...
But, you know, so until they do something, if they ever do something, which I don't see it really happening, unless you see one party actually get a huge majority, Democrats, let's say, and they decide it's time to fix it, I just don't see it happening. I mean, you'd need a 2/3 majority,
You
right?
need 2/3, and that's almost impossible.
Yeah, it's
with
almost impossible now.
the way the map is.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we had the elections of some great presidents, some maybe not as remembered, but certainly the election has significant results in terms of the 1876 election. And we see, again, as we heard in our little intro audio, once again, we're hearing again and again, this is the most important election of our lifetimes. Whether that's true or not, I do want to urge all of you out there to turn out and vote, not just in these elections, but the elections throughout your lifetime. It is a critical part of being a citizen of the United States, a real privilege that historically people have either not had in other parts of the world or even this part of the world, and have fought for throughout America's history, and we should exercise that right. And I urge all of you to do that, not only here in the midterm elections of 2022, but in the future, so that you can say you took part in the next most important election of our lifetime. So thank you everybody out there for listening. We will be back again soon. I'll be joined either by Frank or by Bill, maybe both of them again, or by another guest. And we will be back again with another episode of Wigs for Wigs. Take care, everybody.